Walter, let's together go into a theological debate on the question of God and time. I find it a fascinating one because it's very probative of the kind of God that people believe. And here are the two positions. One is that God is outside of time, a timeless being. The other is that God is in time and an everlasting from everlasting to everlasting. And it's amazing how theologians who believe in exactly the same thing in every possible way will diverge substantially on this point of view. How do you look at it as a philosopher and as an atheist, the conflict among theologians on this topic?
Well, there are really motivations both ways. Theologians want their God, or at least some theologians want their God to be wholly other, totally different from us. That emphasizes the mystery and allows them to answer objections by saying, I don't know, but nobody can know, right? And then you make God eternal. God exists outside of time, is so different that isn't even subject to time and space the way we are. So how could you possibly know what's going on? And I can see the motivation for theologians to hold such a position. But then they're going to lose on the question of, well, why do we care then? If God is in this other world and can't answer prayers and do miracles and so on and guide us, then God is kind of useless. And so the motivation to put God inside of time is for God to be able to do those miracles and answer those prayers. Some theologians even want to have it both ways. They say God exists outside of time before the Big Bang, but once the Big Bang exists, now all of a sudden God's inside of time. But then you have to give up changelessness. And I can't understand how God could change from being outside of time to being inside time, since I would think that whether you're inside time or outside time is an essential property of you. It's not like you could switch from one to the other the way you switch suits.
Well, this is a terrific example of trying to understand whether the concept of God, however you look at it, is coherent.
Right.
It's interesting in its own right, but one thing it'll help us is does this concept make sense? Because if there's an inherent inconsistency, then we know that something about our premises, the existence of God, may be questionable. So let's look at it. Those who would say that God is eternal, who is outside of time, like this because not only does it make God very much transcendent from human beings, but it also makes God at an ultimate level of perfection. Because the concept is that if God changes, that means why is God changing? If God wasn't perfect to begin with, is he trying to get better?
Yeah.
If you're perfect, you can't get better. So you better make God static and unchanging. Another reason is that if God is going to be eternal, then God is never losing his or her past.
Right.
And is never not enjoying or fulfilling a future. So you have both these. So there are these conceptions of God that are trying to be made coherent with the concept of God's perfection.
Exactly. And what it shows really is the complexity of religion. Religion has so many different motives and so many different aspects that's what makes so many people believe in it. And it keeps going because it'll fulfill many different needs with different parts of religion. And the problem is, it can't be one thing that does it all. It's just incoherent to think that there's a God that's going to provide this desire for a transcendent other world that's better than this veil of illusion, and yet also answers our prayers. You want both things, but you can't have both of them in a single God.
Well, I mean, some people, they try. I mean,
Sure.
the eternal God, they would say that God sort of had this a timeless vision of the whole world from beginning to end, almost like an Einsteinian four-dimensional block universe where you see every event in space and in time as an event, and therefore God could set it up so that when people asked for prayer at one point, if he wanted to answer it, then in that one timeless moment, he set the whole system so there would be the right sequence and people would have the illusion of that. I mean, it's a tortuous argument, to be sure.
Right. It is a tortuous argument, and you have to go through it carefully and see whether it really holds up. I mean, when you try to think of analogies. I mean, theologians will say you shouldn't be thinking of analogies because God is wholly other. And that's the drive towards eternality, right? But if you really do try to think of analogies to these four-dimensional space-time worms, those are not the things that are causing events within time. It just doesn't work out in the end. It has to be too torturous to be believable.
Yeah, and that's the argument of the theologians who believe that God is in time. And
Right.
that they would sacrifice the transcendent, and they would have God with a past,
Right.
and they would have God with a future. And so they sacrifice a little bit of the perfection, as it was classically defined, in order to have God being able to have the relationships and the prayers. And so you have to compromise. Whatever you're doing here, you have to make some compromises. You're going to compromise God's perfection, or you're going to compromise God's ability to have relationships. One way or another, you got to compromise.
Problem for theologians is that different members of the of different groups within the people who come to their church are there for different reasons. Some want a holy transcendent. Some want a God to answer their prayers. Some want a good God that's going to love them and care for them. Others want a vengeful God that's going to punish those people that hurt them. They're all there for different reasons. And so if they start trimming and giving up a little bit here and a little bit there to maintain coherence, they're going to lose half of the people who come to church. And that's the theologian's problem, not mine.